Yes. There we go. Well, welcome to A Story to Tell, day 2 of our Celebrate Stewardship 2021 virtual conference. Glad that you could be with us this morning. Sorry that we're not able to be together in person, but also excited that doing it this way allows folks from all over the country to connect versus an event that you might not travel that far for. So welcome, and I'm going to start sharing my screen so that you can see what we're going to get into today. So, a story to tell. Let's look first at our agenda. What are we going to get into this morning? First of all, we're going to talk briefly about why our story is important in our ministry context. We'll get into the basics of good storytelling, again, in a faith-based setting. We'll talk specifically about impact stories. I bet you've heard that's kind of a buzzword, outcome stories, impact stories. People use that interchangeably. It's big in the nonprofit arena and for fundraising in general. So we're going to talk more and take a deeper dive into impact stories. And then we'll get into how you can take your finances in your ministry setting and bring those to life through successful storytelling. And then we'll close out with some next steps for you to take and some Q&A opportunity. So let's dive in. First thing I want to do is just go straight to scripture. Matthew chapter 13, verse 34 tells us Jesus told the crowds all these things in parables. Without a parable, he told them nothing. So we know that Jesus was sort of the ultimate storyteller. He knew the right story for the right audience, told the right way, could teach people, it could motivate them, it could inspire them. He didn't have access to any kind of brain research to support his knowledge in this, but we do today. So we're going to look a little bit first at some brain research and what it tells us about storytelling and how it will help us answer that question, why should we be telling stories in our ministries? I'm going to share with you your brain on data. This is a great graphic from a colleague at the Presbyterian Foundation. Researchers looked at the areas of the brain that activate when a person is presented with facts and data. So your brain on data. And you'll see here that there are 2 areas that responded when people were listening to reading facts, information, charts, that kind of thing. So those 2 areas, if you geek out on science, are Wernick's area, which is mainly deals with language comprehension, and then Broca's area, which gets into the processing. These are both on the left side of the brain. If you've done any basic psychology classes, you know that the left side of the brain is considered the logical side of the brain. It's good at picking out patterns and completing calculations. Again, natural then that it would light up when data is presented to it. So just mainly 2 areas that activate when the brain hears data. When you think about a line item budget, these are the 2 areas of the brain that are lighting up as you review your church's line item budget. So then the researchers got into your brain on stories and look at all of what's happening in the brain when we hear a story. You'll see 8 areas that have lit up, the same 2 areas that lit up when the data was presented, and then 6 new areas, all of which are on the right side of the brain, which is where we see the big picture. That's the side of the brain that activates with images and visuals and where creativity and intuition are really happening. So what we know, why this is important as we answer that question, why stories in our ministries, is that stories stimulate both sides of the brain. The information on the left and the structure and flow on the right as you're telling a story containing those things. And that's what we want, right? With both sides of the brain activated, stories make it easier to connect with people. It makes it's easier for us to integrate new information that we're hearing, connect it with what we already know, and relate it to our experiences. And that, as human beings, is what we're trying to do. So again, as you think about how you share things about your ministry, you may deal in facts sometimes, and that's important. You may deal in line item budgets, hard numbers, that kind of thing. And you can probably name the people you know in your church setting who love data. But you also now see what happens in our brains with stories and how that emotional part has been activated. Again, there's a lot more going on, and that's important to consider as well as we're speaking to folks about our ministries. There's also been some studies that have been done that take a list of words, and people are asked to memorize the words and then be able to recall them a period of time later. And that study has also looked at, we're going to present those same words in a story. And you guessed it, people were better able to recall the words when they heard it in a story than when they just saw the list. So again, important to consider what's happening in the brain as we're hearing stories versus just being given raw data or information. I love this quote from Roger Schenck. He's a psychologist, he's a scientist. He was involved in learning all kinds of wonderful academic credits that I won't get into. But Roger said, humans are not ideally set up to understand logic. They are ideally set up to understand stories. So that is why storytelling is so important and why we're spending some time on it this morning. So let's move into sort of the basics of good storytelling. And these are things for you to consider as you're utilizing storytelling already in your ministry, or maybe you're starting new. Maybe you're looking specifically at how you want to use stories related to stewardship ministry in your congregation. And the first thing to know is who your audience is. Who are you speaking to? Different generations respond to different kinds of stories. Are you speaking with a group of people who are of an older generation and most likely have been part of the church for a long time and have a strong connection over decades, even with your ministry? Connect them with stories that remind them of that rich history. If you're speaking with a younger audience, they like to hear stories about what the church is doing today. How is the church making a difference now? Which isn't to say that either generation doesn't want to hear the other kind of story. But if you aren't cognizant of who you're speaking to and what kind of story you're telling, my observation in our churches is we're very proud of our history. It's beloved. We tend to focus on stories from the past, and sometimes those can overshadow all the wonderful things that we're up to today. So just make sure as you're thinking about how to utilize stories that you know who you're going to be sharing them with. And chances are it's a mixed audience, so you'll be using those mixed kinds. But if you know, again, that you're speaking to a senior breakfast or a young adult small group, that may change which story you pick to tell. Second is understand your audience's motivations. What motivates people to acts of stewardship? If you're utilizing stories with the hope for outcome that people will grow as stewards, what motivates them as stewards? So these are the four things that we are aware of that are really motivational for people as they make gifts of time, talent, and treasure. First is gratitude for what God has done in their own life. Second, faith that God will provide. Third is love and compassion for others. And then finally, belief in the mission and ministry of your church. So those are four important motivations for folks that you'll want to consider as you consider what kind of stories you want to tell and how they connect with those different motivations. And I'm going to share all of this with you post-webinar. I realized I should have said that at the beginning. So if you're taking notes, just know this is coming your way at the end. Third sort of basic for storytelling is, let's go back to Jesus, our master storyteller, and think about how and what he did as he told stories. He knew how to tell stories that people could relate to, right? Whether they were fishermen or Pharisees, he knew how to pick the right story for the right audience. He told stories that people could retell, that they could remember and then pass on to others. So they were shareable stories, memorable. And he also knew how to tell stories that got his message across to everybody, and he used those stories frequently, constantly throughout his ministry. He was using parables or stories, as we talked about earlier. So your storytelling should be doing the same kind of thing as Jesus did through his ministry in terms of that tangibility, shareability, and frequency. Next basic is just think about yourself as a storyteller and the tools that you have available to you. If it's a story you're telling during worship or you're recording on a video, you've got your voice, you have your body, you have space. I know a lot of people say, well, I'm not an actor. I'm not going to do some sort of dramatic interpretation, but you do want to be aware of these assets as you're telling stories to make them engaging. I would suggest once you have a story that you think is a good one to lift up to folks, to practice reading it aloud. And decide how you want to emphasize different points. Is there an appropriate gesture you can use? Do you want to use space in any certain way as you're telling it? I know people who do a really good job of sharing biblical stories as part of their stewardship ministries, really focus on how to put us in the Bible story, how to help us visualize if we're in a temple or we're outside by the sea, really painting that picture for people. Again, activating in the brain those parts that relate to experience and connecting and integrating things together as a way to process what we're hearing and lead to that inspiration and action that we hope for. So you really want to think about how you can use your voice, your body, and your space to help people connect emotionally with your story. And then finally, I'm going to offer up that less can be more. I think sometimes when we start thinking about storytelling, especially some of us who are really passionate about what's going on in our churches, you can come up with some really lengthy pieces, I'm sure. And those are important, but also know that it doesn't have to be a 2-page 500-word piece. Again, you're trying to capture people's attention. You're trying to give them language that helps them visualize what you're telling. You're connecting with their emotions, and then you want to leave them inspired and empowered to do something. So I want to share with you an example of how less can be more. Legend has it that Ernest Hemingway was having lunch with a group of friends in New York in the 1920s, and somebody bet him about writing a story with a full narrative using only 6 words. Could he do it? And the story attributed to Hemingway, which I cannot say for sure that this is true, but it makes a good story for our purposes today, was that he wrote this 6-word story: for sale, baby shoes, never worn. Which is an incredibly powerful story. So there's some other examples there. There's a whole website now about the 6-word story, and people share funny ones, serious ones. And so there's some other examples there in terms of how you can tell a story with just 6 words. So as you think about some of the ministries that are, are meaningful in the life of your church, as you think about connecting folks and their stewardship with those ministries, are there some ways you could utilize something so simple as a 6-word story? Less can be incredibly powerful. Another great quote from Michael Margulies: the stories we tell literally make the world. If you want to change the world, you need to change your story. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and get into how you possibly might be changing your storytelling a little bit as you think about what impact stories are all about. So let's look a little bit at impact stories. But first, let me tell you a story from my own experience with seeing impact stories coming to life in terms of their value. For years, I have volunteered to help with my own church. We have candle tea every December as a Christmas tradition where we show people how Moravians make candles, and we share coffee and sugar cake and all kinds of things, sing carols. It's a beloved tradition for a long time in our church. And so every year after it's over, we get together and we tally up the numbers. We're always excited if we see more visitors than last year, right? Increased revenue. We're quick to graph year after year. Is the line trending up? Are we plateauing? Really, how much money do we have to give away? Because we give away all the proceeds to area charities in the community and other Moravian things. So we're always excited to share that with our folks, especially on Facebook. We've got a great Facebook audience. So we're quick to put that kind of data out there on Facebook. And then every year we share the list, again, thinking about what side of the brain is activating, only 2 areas lighting up. We give a list. Here's all the charities that got money this year from KMLT. And we're so proud because look how long this list is. And all these people were able to get money. Several years ago, we decided we needed to tell some stories of the impact of those gifts, more than just we gave $500 to this group, but what happened. So one of our charities that I am particularly excited about is a local one called Mission Feet First. It provides shoes for people who are homeless or unable to afford shoes, specifically running shoes or walking shoes, to try to help them get out and be active and have the right shoes for that. There's also groups where they sponsor community walks, even training groups if folks really want to get into running more. But they've been putting shoes, they go to elementary schools and they set up shoe shops and kids can come and get shoes for free. So it's a really remarkable mission started by a couple here in Winston-Salem years ago. Okay, so we were excited every year to give them some money and put them on our list. But finally, when it hit us, we should be sharing more about impact. The woman who runs the program, Mission Feet First, was able to tell us how many pairs of shoes that they were able to give away and to get a quote from one of the people who received the shoes and then a mother whose kids got shoes. So we were able to share those testimonials, those short stories about impact with people. And I'm excited to say that we got a reply from someone who saw that on Facebook and said that she had no idea what that mission was about. And she made an additional donation that matched the donation that we had given them from the Candle Tea funds. So they received twice as much money because we realized we needed to focus more on impact and less just on those lists of data. So again, impact stories can be incredibly powerful and motivational. So what do you need to know as you think about telling them? First, the point of an impact story is to help people focus on how they are investing in ministry and not paying the bills. I'm sure you've heard that before as a steward leader, that we want to be sharing language and stories that are, again, are helping people realize that their gifts of time, talent, treasure are to be an investment in the mission and the ministry of the church, not paying the bills. We're going to get more into that in a moment, but imagine saying something like this during the offering, if you're able to speak at that time. Last week, our tithes and offerings traveled around the world as they provided money for young Tanzanian Moravians to buy uniforms for school. It's a short story, one sentence. It's something people can visualize. It's connecting money that they gave for the offering to ministry to impact. So there's simple ways that you can start weaving these in to the conversations within your church. Again, don't require a lot of work, but I love that idea of at the tithes and offerings being able to say, hey, here's what happened last week with the money that you gave. It traveled all around the world, or maybe it went right down the street to support X or Y. So little ways that you can start sharing the impact of people's stewardship. The other value of a good impact story is that you're explaining the reason for the ask. Oftentimes when Chris and I work with leaders in churches, they're frustrated because they're asking for help. They're asking for volunteers, time from people. Maybe they're asking for treasure and they're not getting the response that they want. Maybe that's happened for you in your setting. But imagine using an impact story to make that ask. What does that mean exactly? Well, you've got a hoped for outcome. So you're going to tell a story that you think will move people in that direction. And here's an example. And this comes from an actual pastor who I spoke to recently about what was going on in their church. Imagine you need people to sign up to be volunteers for the church's annual fall festival. It's an event that is offered for the community and the neighbors come and there's all kinds of different booths and food and all the good things that happen at a fun fall festival. So rather than standing up on Sunday or posting a sheet somewhere or sending out a sign up link and asking people to fill slots, what would it be like if instead you spoke with somebody who had volunteered in the past and had them articulate their impact story? And if they weren't willing to share it, then maybe you as a leader share it. And that story might sound something like this. Last year, I helped with the fall festival, specifically with face painting. And one little girl told me that she hoped that the butterfly that I painted on her cheek would never wash off. Her joy over something so small reminded me to also look for the little things in life that bring me joy. So there's impact of a specific act of stewardship. Somebody gave their time and talent to do face painting. This little girl experienced it. She was so excited about it. She never wanted to wash off. And the volunteer walked away thinking, I need to remember to look for happiness in the small things too. I think chances are, if you're sharing stories like that, that's going to be much more motivational for your folks to want to be a part of something than if you just say, please sign up if you're able. Please fill the morning shift. Another thing to be aware of as you start to focus in on impact stories, and a mistake that we see sometimes with churches is that we tend to tell them during worship. We're excited to share them with folks. That's our audience that we have once a week we can count on. And then we may forget to do anything else with that story. So I want to encourage you to make sure, as you've got these really great stories to tell, that you're telling them in every channel possible that's available for you. So that may be on social media. Maybe that's in writing if you are mailing out a print newsletter, an email, however you communicate with people, stories should be there. Maybe you add a story section on the church website. Don't be afraid to use your phone to shoot a video. It used to be that we wanted very professionally done pieces to represent our ministries. And now we're in a day and age where it's totally okay to pull out your phone and record someone telling a story. And sometimes those are even more impactful because they're not rehearsed. They're more genuine and from the heart. So be aware of, as you again are crafting and spending time on these really strong impact stories, that you're utilizing them in a variety of ways and not just putting them in one place and then forgetting about them. The other thing, of course, you want to think about are pictures. We know pictures are incredibly powerful. They give us that visual that we're trying to accomplish as we're telling stories. And oftentimes pictures can convey impact without any words. So think about who the photographers are in your church and how you can put them to use. And oftentimes we see young adults all the time with phones. They love taking photos and sharing photos. So there might be a way to engage some people in your community of faith who aren't engaged in another way as you think about capturing pictures to use to tell stories. Just make sure you've got people's permissions, right? And if you've got children's photos, that you've got permissions to share those. And finally, be thinking about prompts. You may be thinking right now, this is all great, but who's going to be writing all of these stories? I already have enough on my plate. We're a small church. I'm a stewardship committee of one, that kind of thing. I know this is another thing to be thinking about. And this is where simple prompts can really be helpful. So think about things such as, why do you support blank ministry with your time, talent, and treasure? Almost like a mini interview to capture a story. What does blank ministry mean to you? What impact has blank ministry had on you in the last year? Start small, see what God does. You've got people in your congregation who love what they are receiving from the gifts of the community, from God through the life of the church. And I bet they're excited to share those answers, to share those stories. So this could be a really great way to engage a lot of people by putting out some prompts in front of them and inviting a response. Next thing we want to think about as we look at storytelling is how we can use them to bring finances to life. And you see a little graph here. It's of last year's mission and ministry funding, i.e. budget. But rather than presenting a line item budget, we've got this graph that shows amounts of money that go to different categories. So this church has spent time looking at the three main things they're all about. These are the three things we're committed to for Christ: serving others, loving God, and changing lives. And they've done the work to line up their line item budget in these areas. This is a narrative budget, basically. It's storytelling. And this is important. And if it's not something your church is currently using, or if you've used it before but haven't done it in a while, it's time to look at it as a way to really bring finances to life for people. All churches have those line item budgets, and they should be available to anyone and everyone. Financial statements should be shared regularly. You need to be really transparent about what's happening with the money that's flowing through your ministry. But again, if you're only using that line item, you're only activating that very small part of people's brains. And remember, the brain's not set up entirely for logic. We're set up to understand stories. So that narrative budget, or even a narrative financial statement, if you're willing to commit to doing more than just the once a year narrative budget, is really critical to help people break out of the box of how my faith and my finances are in two different places. We hear that a lot from churches, that people want to say faith is here, money's here, and they don't go together. And we know that as stewardship leaders that that's not true. So taking the time to work on a narrative budget, narrative financial statements can be one way to start connecting faith and finances, which is really important. MMFA can help. We've got tools to help you do this. You're not starting from scratch. So keep this in mind as you think about next year, how you want to share your 2022 budget, how you want people to understand what happened in 2021. Strongly suggest that you bring it to life through some storytelling. Second, think about what kind of language that you can use all the time to build that bridge between money and ministry. Again, narrative budgets are typically done once a year. The narrative financial statements maybe every quarter. So you need more frequent reminders. And I love this example that's in number 2. This is what God is up to when ... You could say this aloud during worship, put it in the bulletin, online, etc. This is what God is up to when the lights are on at X Moravian church. This is what God is up to when we allocate money to send kids to camp every summer. That's a great one to use after kids have come back from camp, and you can tell exactly what God was up to in their lives because they were able to go to camp because of people's financial stewardship. Last month, office supplies cost $200. This is how God was at work through the paper, the ink, and the staples that $200 bought. We reminded people that they aren't alone, and we gave them a way to grow in their faith through mailing devotional booklets to our homebound members. We invited people into fellowship and connection by printing flyers to distribute in the neighborhood about our upcoming community supper, etc. Again, there's those things in your budget that you know people don't wake up on Sunday morning and say, I want to give money for office supplies. But if you're able to say, this is what God is up to through the office supplies that we are buying, you can start to remind people that money is funding ministry. It's not about the budget, it's investing in mission and ministry. I bet as steward leaders, you may have read Cliff Christopher's great book, Rich Church, Poor Church. If you haven't, I highly recommend it, and MMFA can help you have copies available. But in that book, Cliff makes the point that a church with a rich church mindset has vision that inspires. It tells stories to answer the why should I give money to the church? And those stories could be biblical stories. You're grounding people in the theology of our identity as God's stewards, or they could be the impact stories that we just spent time on. The words of people who have a passion for a ministry, explaining how a mission meets needs, articulating how people grow as a result. Ideally, you're using both of those kinds of stories with a rich church mindset, because the Bible is rich with stories, specifically stories about what stewardship means, what our identity as stewards means. If you're not spending much time intentionally with those stories, would recommend that you look at that. MMFA can help with that too. We've got a list of all those, some of those great stories on our website, and I'd be happy to talk to you about specific Bible studies, et cetera. And then the impact stories as well, again, that are giving people reasons to answer that question, why should I give money to the church? And that's part of Cliff's rich church mindset. Again, it's inspiring vision, not investing in a budget, but in ministry. And Cliff makes the point that the bottom line is that a rich church mindset isn't focused on the budget or having to have money to keep the church alive. Fewer and fewer people care if the church is alive per se. They're caring about what's happening through the church out in God's world where there are real needs that need to be met. So you're focusing on the faith and the fulfillment aspect of finances for God's work in the world when you've got the rich church mindset, according to Cliff. The next thing to think about, again, we've kind of touched on this a little bit as you're bringing your finances to life, are money testimonials. I'm just going to call them that, and being creative with those testimonials around money. And I would go ahead and preface this, warn you that to me this is where the hardest work can take place. What do I mean by money testimonials? Tell the story of somebody who made a pledge for the first time. and what happened. Someone who increased a commitment for the first time. If you've got someone looking at your church finances, you know there's a body of people who give the same amount every year, but there's also some people who increase. What is that story? Why are they doing that? And what was the outcome? What was the impact on their life as a result of that money change? I think these are harder stories to get. As I was saying, you may have to set up a way people could anonymously submit them, or I will challenge you to consider whether you are the one willing to share a money testimonial. What do you think about when you think about your own financial stewardship that might have impact on other people? And also think about the people in your church who have left bequests, who are no longer living, who have stories to tell about why they created those planned gifts for the church. Maybe there's a family member of that person who's still alive, who you could interview to tell that story. They'd be willing to tell the story themselves, assuming that the person who created the gift didn't want to remain anonymous. Bequests can be really powerful for all ages. For folks who are in a certain phase of life, it reminds them, church is important to me. I want to make a plan to support the church beyond my lifetime. For somebody who's middle age, maybe even younger, it gives us role models and inspires us. Hey, I want to be a person who's able to do something like that when I'm of an age to be getting more serious about my plans. So don't be afraid to look to past gifts that have had impact on your ministry and see if there's some storytelling there that can bring those monetary gifts to life in terms of impact. And I am actually going to share an example of just such a story with you now. So I had the pleasure of working with a church one time around some gift planning efforts, and they sent out a mailing and they asked people to return a card on which they could say whether they'd included the church in their estate plans, did they want to be contacted by somebody to talk about their gift, etc. MFA will do that for your congregation free of charge, by the way. So just putting a plug in if you want to focus on encouraging people to think about gift planning and future gifts for the congregation. So this gentleman returned his card and I reached out and said, can I come talk to you about your gift? And he said, sure. He was in a retirement community, probably in his early 90s when I got to sit with him. And I want to tell you what he said and then share with you. I had the opportunity to tell this story to the congregation during worship. So he told me, Laura, there's no need to make a big fuss about this. He went on to say that he imagined everybody was leaving a portion of their estate to the church, but they just didn't send in their card. And then this is what he said to me as he held my hand. It's not about me. It's about this place and what it has done for me. It's about worshiping in God's acre as the sun rises on Easter morning. It's about making sure that this church will be around for another 245 years. It's about God's hand in my hand my whole life. My goodness, how could I not give back? Again, I got to tell that story during worship as we promoted this gift planning effort for the congregation. And I watched several people, myself included, wiped tears from their eyes hearing this story. I would like to imagine that at least one person sitting there that day was motivated to their own act of generosity. Maybe it was something so grand as going to a lawyer and making a financial commitment to the church through their will, just as this gentleman had done. Or maybe it was something grand in another way, which is just saying a prayer of thanksgiving for how God has moved in their life through the life of their church. Again, reminding people of the gratitude that they feel for the ministries that are taking place in your community of faith can go a long way. And this was a pretty simple story to tell. So maybe you have somebody who is an older member of your congregation, you go visit them, they're not able to get to worship in person if you're worshiping in person, but they may have a story to tell you about why they're generous still to the church. And those can be really powerful and have a lot of impact. I certainly felt the impact of this gentleman's simple story. He has since passed on and is in a much better place than we are. And the money that he left to the church is involved in some really neat ministry. And the church is very aware to share how his money is funding ministry. So it's a beautiful thing. So what are next steps? I want to give you a few takeaways, things to do, and then we'll open up for some conversation, and I'll get your reactions to all this storytelling. First thing to think about is, what stories does my church have to tell? As you think again about the missions, the ministries that are really important to people, how they're making an impact in the world, who's involved, and what stories are there to tell. And this to me is really the fun part. And then you want to identify who are the people who have gifts for storytelling. That could be writers, taking photos, people who like to interview and just sit and talk and listen. Folks are good at visualization, creativity. Who has those gifts in your ministry setting, and who you think would be willing to use them to work on telling some stories? I think sometimes we go straight to the, oh, I don't want to speak during worship. I can't be a part of this. There's so much more to it than that. So you really, again, want to look to those folks that are good at listening, taking notes, and being able to help craft a good story. Then I would invite you to map out a plan. Think about, when do you want to tell them? Start small. Maybe it's just incorporating something into worship, again, via the offering, our tithes and treasures are traveling all over the world kind of statement, or this is what God is up to when the water is running at our church and the youth are having a car wash, or whatever example you can think of. Again, you want to think about utilizing visuals, print, all the different ways that you communicate with folks. Look at your calendar. Okay, what are the dates coming up that are important for our community of faith? I know at least one of you is at a church with an anniversary coming up. That's a great Sunday to be telling some stories. Again, looking at the past, but also showing impact for today and moving into the future. What's the story of our congregation for the next 50 years, let's say? And then I would also say, don't be afraid to look at other churches who tell stories well. Maybe you're aware of a congregation that has a gifted storytelling ministry. They're using stories to support their stewardship. Don't be afraid to get on websites and just browse around for ideas, and MMFA can also share some good resources there too. Which leads me into my last point. Always a next step for you is to let us help. Our services are free of charge. Whether we talk for 10 minutes or an hour and a half, I will love every minute of it, in terms of being able to listen to you, hear what's going on in your mission and your ministry, and see how we can work together to move that ministry forward. Storytelling is a lot of fun. Again, as you think about hearing stories in your own life and how they've motivated you, you know the impact that they can have. And something that I think, as you start to focus on them, especially for your stewardship ministry, will really lead to a lot of beautiful conversation in your congregation and a lot of action and positive results. Finally, I want to share this quote from Debbie Thomas. What can we say about who, where, and what God is in our church? Is there anything about our experience of Christ that is beautiful enough to share? If not, why not? Well, we know that you all have many beautiful things about your experiences with Christ, what God is up to in your church, to share. No reason not to. Got tools to help you do it. So look forward to seeing how we can work together on that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to stop recording, and then we'll get into some conversations. So hang with me just a second as I navigate my way out of this, and hopefully don't press the wrong button.